You're giving away your last meal to a stranger? The question hung in the air like a challenge, but Emily Carter never answered it. Because sometimes the smallest decisions are made in silence. It was nearly 10:30 on a cold Thursday night in downtown Chicago. The dinner rush was over. The polished floors of Harbor House Grill reflected the warm amber glow of the hanging lights. Most of the customers had already gone home. The laughter, the conversations, the clinking glasses that had filled the restaurant just an hour earlier had faded into a distant memory. Now only the hum of the refrigerators and the occasional scrape of a chair being stacked echoed through the room. Emily stood near the service counter, exhausted. Her feet ached after a 10-hour shift. Her shoulders felt heavy. She reached into her apron pocket and counted the cash she had earned in tips. $23.40. Not terrible. Not great. Just enough to get through another day. She let out a quiet breath and glanced at the wrapped turkey sandwich sitting beside her water bottle. It wasn't much. Just a simple sandwich she had packed that morning before rushing to work. But tonight it mattered. Payday wasn't until tomorrow afternoon. Her checking account was down to less than $5. The sandwich was supposed to be dinner and breakfast combined. The kind of calculation millions of people make every day without telling anyone. Emily wasn't looking for sympathy. She never had. At 25, she had already learned that life rarely slowed down long enough to feel sorry for yourself. Her father had passed away years earlier. Her mother lived 3 states away and struggled with health issues of her own. Most of Emily's paycheck disappeared the same day it arrived. Rent, utilities, groceries, and every month, without fail, she sent money to help her younger brother, Mason, stay enrolled at the state university. She told everyone she was doing fine. Most days she even convinced herself it was true. She picked up her sandwich and headed toward the employee exit behind the restaurant. Outside, the wind swept through the alleyway between the buildings. The city felt different at night. Quieter, colder, more honest somehow. That was when she saw him. An older man sat alone on a metal bench near the loading dock. His gray maintenance uniform looked worn from years of use. A faded name patch hung loosely above his chest pocket. Thomas. A mop bucket stood beside him. His shoulders slumped forward. His hands rested quietly in his lap. At first glance, he looked like any other janitor finishing a long shift. The kind of person people walked past every day without noticing. The kind of person whose presence was only acknowledged when something needed cleaning. Emily had seen him before in the building complex. Always working. Always polite. Always invisible. Tonight something felt different. The old man wasn't looking at his phone. He wasn't reading. He wasn't doing anything at all. He simply sat there staring into the darkness beyond the parking lot. Then Emily noticed his eyes drift toward the sandwich in her hand. It lasted only a second. A small glance. Almost embarrassed. Almost apologetic. But it told her everything she needed to know. Hunger has a language of its own. People who have known it recognize it instantly. Emily slowed her steps. The cold wind tugged at her jacket. The practical voice in her mind reminded her that she needed that sandwich. Tomorrow was still hours away. She had responsibilities. Bills. A brother counting on her. She wasn't rich. She wasn't comfortable. She wasn't even sure how she would stretch the next 24 hours. Yet another voice whispered something else. Something simpler. The old man looked tired. Not physically tired. Soul tired. The kind of exhaustion that settles deep behind the eyes. Emily looked down at the sandwich. Then back at the man. Somewhere above them, a security camera blinked quietly beneath a steel overhang. Neither of them noticed it. The lens captured everything without judgment. Just another ordinary moment on an ordinary night. Or so it seemed. Emily walked toward the bench. The older man looked up, surprised. She offered a small smile and held out the sandwich. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The city lights shimmered across the wet pavement. The wind carried the distant sound of traffic. And in that quiet space between strangers, a story began that neither of them could possibly understand yet. The older man looked at the sandwich as though it were something far more valuable than bread and turkey. His weathered hands remained motionless on his lap. For several seconds he did not reach for it. He simply stared at Emily with an expression she could not quite place. Pride perhaps. Or surprise. Maybe both. "I cannot take that," he said quietly. His voice was gentle, carrying the rough edges of age and long days spent speaking very little. "You worked for it." Emily shrugged and pushed the wrapped sandwich slightly closer. I will be fine. The old man smiled faintly. It was the kind of smile people wear when they know life well enough not to argue with kindness. Still, he hesitated. You should keep it, he said. Young people need to eat too. Emily almost laughed. If only he knew. She had skipped lunch that afternoon to save money. Breakfast had been little more than coffee and a granola bar. Yet standing there in the cold Chicago night, she found herself strangely unwilling to walk away. Trust me, she said. I will survive. The old man finally accepted the sandwich. He held it carefully, almost respectfully, before peeling back the paper. The aroma drifted into the cold air. Emily noticed the way his eyes softened. Hunger had been there. Real hunger. Not the inconvenience people joked about after missing a snack. The deeper kind. The kind that settles quietly behind dignity and waits. He took a small bite and closed his eyes for a moment. Not dramatically. Not for attention. Just a brief pause that spoke volumes. Emily looked away to give him privacy. Sometimes kindness feels more comfortable when nobody watches. Above them, the security camera continued its silent recording. The red indicator light blinked steadily against the darkness. Neither of them paid it any attention. The old man swallowed and nodded. Thank you. 2 simple words. Yet they carried more weight than many speeches. Emily sat down on the far end of the bench. The cold metal pressed through her uniform. For a few moments they listened to the distant sounds of the city. Traffic rolling through intersections. A train horn somewhere beyond the skyline. The steady rhythm of a world that rarely stopped long enough to notice people like them. Long day? Emily asked. The old man chuckled softly. At my age, every day feels long. She smiled. Fair enough. He took another bite and looked toward the office towers surrounding them. Their glass walls reflected thousands of lights into the night sky. Funny thing about those buildings, he said. Everyone notices who works on the top floors. Emily followed his gaze. The executives. Exactly. His eyes lingered on the tallest tower in the district. Nobody notices who cleans the floors after they leave. Emily knew he was right. She thought about all the customers she served every week. Lawyers. Executives. Consultants. Investors. People who wore expensive watches and never glanced twice at the maintenance crews working around them. People should notice, she said. The old man smiled again. This time there was something warmer in it. Maybe, but the world gets busy. He paused before adding, the good ones notice anyway. Emily felt unexpectedly embarrassed by the compliment. She was not trying to be good. She had simply seen someone who needed help. The conversation drifted naturally after that. No dramatic stories. No life-changing revelations. Just 2 strangers sharing a quiet moment at the end of a long day. The old man told her he had worked in buildings for decades. Different jobs. Different cities. Different uniforms. Emily spoke about her brother Mason and his engineering classes. She talked about the endless balancing act of rent, bills, and responsibility. Through it all, the old man listened carefully. Not the way most people listened while waiting for their turn to speak. He listened as though every word mattered. As though she mattered. When she finished describing Mason's latest tuition payment, he nodded thoughtfully. You must love him very much. Emily stared down at her hands. He is family. That is rare these days. His voice carried an unexpected sadness. For a moment, a shadow crossed his expression before disappearing again. Emily wondered. What memories lived behind those tired eyes? But she did not ask. Some stories reveal themselves in time. Others stay hidden until the moment they are needed. The old man finished the last bite of the sandwich and folded the wrapper neatly. He looked down at it for a second before slipping it into a nearby trash bin. Then he stood slowly, gripping the handle of his mop bucket. The cold wind swept across the alley once more. You know, he said, looking back at Emily. Most people spend their whole lives trying to be important. She waited. Very few spend their lives trying to be kind. His gaze held hers for a moment longer than expected. That is why kindness is worth more. Emily smiled politely, unsure what to say. The old man returned the smile and adjusted his worn jacket. Then he started walking toward the service entrance of the neighboring office tower. Halfway there, he paused and glanced back. Good night, Emily. She blinked. She had never told him her name. Before she could ask how he knew it, he had already disappeared through the glass doors, leaving her alone beneath the city lights with a strange feeling she could not explain. Emily stood for a moment staring at the glass doors long after Thomas had disappeared inside the office tower. The cold air brushed against her cheeks, but she barely noticed it. One thought repeated itself in her mind. How did he know her name? She replayed the conversation. She had spoken about her brother, about work, about bills, but she had never introduced herself. Not once. A strange feeling settled over her as she walked toward the train station a few blocks away. It was not fear. It was curiosity, the kind that lingers quietly in the background long after a conversation ends. By the time she reached her small apartment on the north side of the city, midnight had come and gone. The apartment was modest. One bedroom, a tiny kitchen, a couch that had seen better days. Yet it was home. Emily kicked off her shoes and checked her phone. There was a text from Mason. Just finished studying. Love you, sis. Thanks for everything. She smiled. Somehow those 6 words made the exhaustion feel lighter. The next morning arrived. Too quickly. Gray clouds covered the Chicago skyline. Emily woke to the sound of her alarm and immediately checked her bank account. Her paycheck had not arrived yet. $4.78 remained. She laughed softly at the number. Not because it was funny, but because worrying about it would not change it. She grabbed her coat and headed to Harbor House Grill for another shift. Fridays were always busy. The lunch crowd started arriving before 11. By noon, every table was full. Business executives filled the booths near the windows. Tourists snapped photos near the entrance. The smell of grilled salmon and fresh bread drifted through the restaurant. Emily moved quickly from table to table, balancing trays, refilling drinks, smiling through the rush. Most customers barely looked up from their conversations. Some thanked her politely. Others acted as though she were part of the furniture. It did not bother her anymore. At least, that was what she told herself. Around 2 o'clock, she stepped into the service hallway to catch her breath. That was when she noticed him again. Thomas stood across the lobby of the neighboring office building visible through the large glass windows. He pushed a janitor cart slowly across the marble floor. Several people walked past him without a glance. A group of employees in expensive suits entered the elevator. Not one acknowledged his presence. Emily remembered what he had said the night before. Everyone notices who works on the top floors. Nobody notices who cleans them. She found herself watching longer than she intended. A young businessman nearly bumped into the cart while staring at his phone. He never apologized. Thomas simply moved aside and continued working. No anger. No complaint. Just quiet patience. Emily shook her head and returned to work. But throughout the afternoon, she kept noticing things she had never paid attention to before. The maintenance workers who emptied trash bins. The elderly woman who cleaned the public restrooms. The security guard standing near the entrance for hours at a time. People passed them constantly without making eye contact. Invisible, just as Thomas had described. Later, that evening, as the dinner crowd began arriving, Emily carried a tray toward table 12 when she overheard 2 customers talking. That old janitor from the tower, one man said. I see him every day. Never says much. His companion laughed. Nobody even knows who he is. Emily slowed slightly. Something about the comment bothered her. Not because it was cruel, because it was true. Nobody knew who he was. Nobody cared enough to ask. Yet for some reason, she could not stop thinking about him. Near closing time, she stepped outside to throw away a bag of trash. Across the street, she spotted Thomas once more. He was standing near a flower vendor on the corner. The old man reached into his pocket and purchased a single white carnation. Just one. Nothing extravagant. Nothing expensive. Then he carefully tucked the flower beneath his arm and continued walking. Emily watched him disappear into the crowd. She wondered who the flower was for. A wife perhaps. A friend. A memory. There was a story there. She could feel it. Everyone has a story. Most people simply never stop long enough to hear it. As she headed back inside, her manager called her over. Emily, he said, holding a clipboard. Corporate is sending a review team next week. Big investors. Important people. We need everything perfect. Emily nodded and returned to work. She had no way of knowing that somewhere high above the city, behind the glass walls of one of Chicago's most powerful corporate offices, a conversation was already taking place. A conversation that would soon connect her life to the quiet old janitor in ways she could never imagine. The following Tuesday began with rain. Not a storm. Just the steady gray drizzle that turned Chicago's streets into mirrors and made the city feel slower than usual. Emily arrived at Harbor House Grill 15 minutes early. She needed every shift she could get. The previous weekend's tips had helped, but not by much. Rent was due in less than 2 weeks. Mason's next tuition payment was approaching, and unexpected expenses seemed to appear whenever life finally felt manageable. She tied her apron, checked the dining room, and immediately noticed tension in the air. Managers were moving faster than normal. Staff members were whispering near the kitchen entrance. Even the owner had arrived before sunrise. Something was happening. Corporate review today, one server muttered while arranging silverware. Apparently, some huge investors are touring the district. Emily nodded. She remembered what her manager had mentioned days earlier. Important visitors. Important money. Important people. The restaurant spent the entire morning preparing. Tables were polished twice. Menus were replaced. Every detail was inspected. By noon, the atmosphere felt less like a restaurant and more like a stage before a performance. Around 1 o'clock, the lunch rush arrived. Executives filled the dining room. Conversations about acquisitions, stock prices, and quarterly earnings floated through the air. Emily moved between tables with practiced efficiency. Smile. Refill. Clear. Repeat. The rhythm was familiar. Safe. Predictable. Then her manager called an emergency staff meeting near the kitchen. Everyone gathered around. The owner's face looked unusually serious. "I have some difficult news," he said. The room fell silent. Emily felt her stomach tighten instantly. Difficult news rarely arrived carrying good intentions. The owner cleared his throat. "The company that owns this property is restructuring several locations." No one spoke. "We are reducing labor costs effective next month." The words landed like cold rain. A few servers exchanged nervous glances. One employee quietly lowered her eyes. Everyone understood what restructuring meant. Jobs, hours, paychecks, futures. Some positions will be eliminated, the owner continued. Final decisions will be made within 2 weeks. Emily barely heard the rest. Her thoughts immediately raced toward Mason. Tuition, books, rent, utilities, groceries. Numbers began stacking themselves inside her mind. Numbers that never seemed to stop growing. She forced herself to remain calm. Panicking would not change anything. Yet the uncertainty settled heavily on her chest. When the meeting ended, employees returned to work carrying invisible weight on their shoulders. Smiles became harder. Conversations became shorter. The dining room still looked elegant. The chandeliers still glowed. Customers still laughed over expensive lunches. But behind the scenes, fear had quietly entered the building. Hours later, during a brief break, Emily stepped outside under the covered service entrance. Rain tapped softly against the pavement. Across the street, she spotted Thomas pushing his janitor cart through the lobby of the office tower. For some reason, seeing him brought a small sense of comfort. He moved at the same steady pace as always. No rush, no frustration, just patience, the kind earned through decades of experience. She watched him stop beside a trash bin near the entrance. A young employee hurried past carrying a briefcase. Papers slipped from his folder and scattered onto the wet sidewalk. Without hesitation, Thomas parked his cart and helped gather every page. The employee accepted the papers without even looking at him. No thank you. No acknowledgement. He simply hurried away. Thomas smiled anyway, then returned to work. Emily shook her head. Most people would have been annoyed. Thomas seemed untouched by it, almost as though he measured success differently than everyone else. A few minutes later, her phone vibrated. It was a message from Mason. "Good news. I got an A on my engineering project." Emily smiled despite everything. "Congratulations. Proud of you," she typed back immediately. Then another message arrived. "Could not have done it without your help." Her eyes stung slightly. Not from sadness. From responsibility. Some people carry briefcases. Some carry stock portfolios. Emily carried people. That was the difference. As evening approached, the rain finally began to fade. The city lights reflected across the wet streets like liquid gold. Inside the office tower across from the restaurant, the top-floor conference room remained illuminated long after most employees had gone home. Several executives sat around a polished table reviewing reports and schedules. At the head of the room sat a man whose decisions influenced thousands of lives every day. Ethan Reed listened quietly while others spoke. Then a member of his staff placed a tablet in front of him. "There is one more item," the executive said. Ethan glanced down. A security video appeared on the screen. Grainy footage. A service entrance. A cold Chicago night. A young waitress offering her only sandwich to an elderly janitor sitting alone on a bench. The room fell silent as the recording played. The video lasted less than 2 minutes. Yet by the time it ended, nobody in the conference room said a word. Ethan Reed sat motionless at the head of the table, his eyes fixed on the frozen image displayed on the screen. The frame showed Emily standing beneath the service entrance lights, extending her sandwich toward Thomas without hesitation. No cameras, no audience, no expectation of reward. Just a simple act of kindness performed when nobody important appeared to be watching. The executive beside him shifted uncomfortably. Our security department flagged it during a routine review, he explained. At first we thought it was nothing unusual. Ethan remained silent. The room waited. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. Nothing unusual? He repeated quietly. The executive swallowed. I mean, it seemed like a small gesture. Ethan looked back at the screen. Small gestures. Funny how people use that phrase. History was built on small gestures. Families were built on small gestures. Character revealed itself through small gestures. The things people did when there was no spotlight often mattered more than anything they did when the world was watching. Do you know how many people pass through that district every day? Ethan asked. Nobody answered. Thousands. His voice remained calm. Thousands of educated professionals. Thousands of successful people. Thousands of individuals who pride themselves on leadership. He pointed toward the image of Emily. Yet she was the one who stopped. The room fell quiet again. Ethan stood and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Chicago. Evening lights stretched across the city like stars scattered across concrete. Somewhere below, millions of stories unfolded every day. Most would never be noticed. Some deserved to be. Where is the employee now? He asked. Still working at Harbor House Grill. Another executive replied. Her record is excellent. No complaints. Reliable. Consistent. Ethan nodded slowly. And Thomas? This time the room became even quieter. Several executives exchanged brief glances. They knew better than to speak casually about Thomas Reed. Not because of his title, not because of wealth, because of who he was. A man who had quietly shaped the values of one of the most influential business leaders in the country. He continues his volunteer program at the district properties, someone answered. Ethan smiled faintly. That sounded exactly like his father. Most people assumed Thomas worked because he needed to. Very few understood the truth. Years earlier, after retirement, Thomas had chosen a different path. He wanted to see how people treated those who could offer them nothing in return. So he traded boardrooms for maintenance uniforms, expensive offices for service hallways, status for anonymity. The experiment had taught him many things. Some encouraging, some disappointing. Yet he never stopped believing in people. Ethan glanced at the image again. Pull every available camera angle from that night, he instructed. I want the full recording. Yes, sir. And arrange a visit to Harbor House Grill. Several executives looked surprised. Personally, one asked. Ethan turned. Personally. The meeting ended shortly afterward. As the room emptied, Ethan remained behind. The city lights reflected across the glass windows while memories surfaced from years long past. He remembered being 12 years old and watching Thomas stop to help a stranded motorist during a snowstorm. He remembered his father spending weekends repairing playground equipment at community parks without telling anyone. He remembered countless lessons about dignity, respect, and character. Lessons that had nothing to do with money. The older Ethan became, the more he realized how rare those values were. His phone buzzed. A text message appeared. It was from Thomas. Just a simple message. Hope your meeting went well. Ethan laughed softly. Even now, his father never mentioned himself. Never mentioned the volunteer work. Never mentioned the people he helped. The message was entirely typical. Ethan replied immediately. It went well. We need to talk soon. A few moments later, another message arrived. Everything okay? Ethan looked once more at the image frozen on the conference room screen. Emily standing there in the cold, offering her last meal to a man she believed was just a janitor. He smiled. More than okay. Then he slipped his phone into his pocket and headed for the elevator. Across the city, Emily was finishing another exhausting shift, completely unaware that one decision made in a quiet alley had already begun changing the course of her future. Sometimes opportunities announce themselves with headlines and speeches. Other times they begin with a sandwich, a security camera, and a stranger who never forgot an act of kindness. 3 days later, Harbor House Grill had never looked more polished. Every tablecloth sat perfectly flat. Every glass sparkled beneath the dining room lights. Managers moved through the restaurant with nervous energy, double-checking details that had already been checked twice. Word had spread quickly. A major corporate delegation was scheduled to arrive for lunch. Nobody knew exactly why. Nobody knew exactly who would be coming. They only knew the visitors were important enough to make ownership nervous. Emily tied her apron and began preparing for the afternoon rush. The uncertainty surrounding possible layoffs still lingered over the staff like a cloud. Conversations remained quieter than usual. Smiles required more effort. Every employee understood that their future might depend on decisions being made by people they would never meet. Around 11:30, a line of black vehicles pulled up outside the restaurant. The atmosphere changed instantly. Through the front windows, employees watched professionally dressed men and women step onto the sidewalk. Managers straightened their jackets. The owner practically rushed toward the entrance. Emily remained near the service station, unaware that her day was about to become unforgettable. The delegation entered with the confidence that comes from influence. Conversations throughout the dining room softened. Heads turned. Several guests recognized faces from business magazines and financial news programs. Then one final figure stepped through the entrance. Tall, composed, dressed in a charcoal suit that looked understated despite its obvious quality. Ethan Reed. The owner immediately greeted him with both hands extended. "Mr. Reed, welcome. It is an honor." Ethan smiled politely. "Thank you for having us." Emily froze for half a second when she heard the name. Reed. Something about it felt familiar. She could not explain why. Then work pulled her attention elsewhere. Orders arrived. Drinks needed refilling. Customers needed service. Life continued moving. Ethan and his team were seated near the center of the restaurant. Throughout lunch, he remained attentive but quiet. He listened more than he spoke. Occasionally, he glanced around the room, observing details others might overlook. Staff interactions, customer behavior, the rhythm of the restaurant itself. Several times his eyes landed briefly on Emily. She assumed he was simply evaluating service quality like any executive visitor. Nothing more. Shortly after 1 o'clock, an unexpected request changed everything. Ethan stood and approached the owner. Their conversation lasted less than a minute. The owner's expression shifted from confusion to surprise. Then he nodded repeatedly. Within moments, every television screen in the restaurant flickered to life. Conversation slowed. Employees exchanged puzzled looks. A manager wheeled a portable display screen into the center of the dining room. Customers looked up from their meals. Nobody understood what was happening. Emily certainly did not. She stood beside the service station, holding a tray of iced tea glasses. Then the video began playing. Grainy security footage appeared on every screen. A service entrance. A rainy Chicago night. A bench near the loading dock. Emily felt the blood drain from her face. She recognized the scene instantly. The sandwich. Thomas. The conversation. The entire restaurant watched in silence as the recording unfolded. Employees stopped moving. Customers stopped eating. Managers stood frozen. The footage showed Emily offering her meal to the elderly janitor. It showed Thomas initially refusing. It showed her insisting. It showed every quiet moment she had completely forgotten. By the time the recording ended, the restaurant had become almost silent. Emily wished the floor would open beneath her. She hated attention. She hated being the center of a room. Confusion flooded through her mind. Why was this being shown? Why here? Why now? She looked toward Ethan Reed. The billionaire executive stood calmly near the display screen. His expression carried neither amusement nor superiority, only sincerity. Then he walked to the front of the room. Every eye followed him. Some employees glanced toward Emily. Others looked at the frozen image still displayed on the screens. The owner seemed just as confused as everyone else. Ethan paused for a moment before speaking. "Many people have asked why I requested this video be shown today." His voice carried easily across the room. Nobody interrupted. The answer is simple. He turned toward the image of Thomas sitting on the bench. A faint smile touched his face. "Because the man in this recording matters very much to me." Emily felt her heart begin to race. Something was happening. Something far bigger than she had imagined. Ethan looked around the dining room one final time before his gaze settled on the image of the elderly janitor. When he spoke again, his voice softened. Most people who pass him every day see a maintenance worker. He paused. I see something very different. The silence inside Harbor House Grill seemed to stretch forever. Forks rested on plates untouched. Conversations had completely disappeared. Even the kitchen staff standing near the doorway had stopped moving. Every eye remained fixed on Ethan Reed. The billionaire glanced once more at the image frozen on the screen behind him. Thomas sitting quietly on a bench. Emily offering him her sandwich. One simple moment. One ordinary act of compassion. Yet somehow it had become the center of the room. Ethan drew a slow breath. For the last 7 years, he said, that man has volunteered throughout our properties across the city. A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd. Employees exchanged confused looks. Customers leaned forward in their chairs. Ethan continued. Most people assumed he worked because he needed the paycheck. A faint smile crossed his face. The truth is much different. He turned toward the screen. He does it because he believes character is easier to recognize when nobody knows who you are. Emily felt her heart pounding in her chest. The pieces were beginning to connect, but not completely. Not yet. She looked at the frozen image of Thomas and remembered the conversations they had shared. The flower he purchased. The way he helped strangers without expecting thanks. The way he listened. The way he noticed things others ignored. Suddenly, every memory felt different. More important somehow. Ethan stepped closer to the center of the room. His voice softened. When I was a boy, he taught me that the measure of a person is not what they do when recognition is guaranteed. He paused. It is what they do when nobody is paying attention. Several people lowered their eyes. The message landed harder than anyone expected. Ethan looked toward Emily for the first time. Not as a billionaire looking at an employee. Not as a business leader evaluating performance. Simply as a son carrying gratitude. Emily stood frozen beside the service station. She had no idea where to look. Then Ethan spoke the words that changed everything. The man in that video. His voice caught slightly before he continued. The man sitting on that bench is my father. The room erupted with gasps. Several customers visibly froze. One server nearly dropped the tray she was holding. The owner's jaw literally fell open. Emily stared at Ethan as though she had misheard him. His father. Not a former employee. Not a trusted advisor. Not a retired executive. His father. The elderly janitor she had shared a sandwich with was the father of one of the most powerful business leaders in America. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The revelation settled over the room like a wave. Ethan nodded toward the screen. Thomas Reed built a successful life many years ago. He could spend every day in comfort if he wanted. A few people exchanged stunned glances. Instead, he chose to spend his retirement meeting people, learning from them, observing how they treat those who seem unimportant. The silence returned. This time it felt different. Heavier. More reflective. Ethan smiled faintly. Most never recognize him. Emily remembered the businessman who accepted help gathering his papers without offering thanks. She remembered countless people walking past Thomas without acknowledgement. She remembered the conversations about invisible workers. Suddenly those moments carried an entirely new meaning. 3 days after that video was recorded, Ethan continued. My father called me. A warm expression crossed his face. He does not usually talk about himself. In fact, he avoids it whenever possible. A few people chuckled softly. But that night he told me about a young waitress who gave away her only meal because she thought someone else needed it more. Ethan looked directly at Emily. He told me he had met someone extraordinary. Emily immediately shook her head. No, she whispered under her breath. I am not. But nobody heard her. Or perhaps nobody believed her. Ethan did. That was the problem. He believed every word. My father has spent years meeting thousands of people. His voice grew stronger. Yet he could not stop talking about her kindness. Several employees glanced toward Emily with entirely new expressions. Not envy. Not judgment. Respect. Ethan took one final step forward. That video was never about a sandwich. He looked around the room. It was about something much harder to find. The restaurant remained completely silent. Ethan's gaze moved from face to face, then finally returned to Emily. Character. The words seemed to echo through the room. And for the first time since this strange afternoon had begun, Emily realized that this story was not ending. It was only beginning. For several seconds after Ethan spoke, nobody seemed to know what to do. The restaurant remained suspended in a strange silence where every person present was re-examining what they thought they knew about status, success, and value. Emily stood motionless near the service station, her hands trembling slightly around the tray she still carried. She wished she could disappear. Yet at the same time, part of her wanted answers. Ethan Reed turned toward her and offered a reassuring smile. It was not the smile of a billionaire addressing an employee. It was the smile of someone grateful. "Emily," he said gently, "would you join me for a moment?" Every eye followed her as she slowly stepped forward. She felt dozens of people watching. Customers, co-workers, managers. Even the owner seemed unable to look away. When she reached the front of the room, Ethan nodded respectfully. "First, thank you." Emily blinked. "For what?" she asked quietly. A few people smiled at the sincerity of the question. Ethan glanced toward the frozen image on the screen. "For seeing my father as a person." The words landed with surprising force. Emily lowered her eyes. Anyone would have done the same. A soft murmur moved through the room. Ethan shook his head. "That is the problem." He paused. Most people did not. The truth of those words settled over everyone present. Ethan continued. "Over the last several years, my father met thousands of people while volunteering throughout our properties. He spoke with security guards, maintenance workers, food service employees, delivery drivers, receptionists, and cleaning crews. His expression grew thoughtful. Many were kind. Many were decent. But very few stopped when there was nothing to gain." Emily remembered that night again. The cold wind. The bench. The sandwich. She had never viewed the moment as important. To her it had been a simple choice. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and removed a folded piece of paper. "The day after he met you, my father wrote something." He carefully unfolded it. The restaurant became silent once more. He said, "Today I met a young woman who reminded me that goodness still exists when nobody is looking. She gave away what little she had because she believed someone else needed it more. The world measures wealth in dollars. I measure it differently." Ethan lowered the paper. Several employees quietly wiped tears from their eyes. Even the owner looked emotional. Emily felt her throat tighten. Nobody had ever described her that way before. Certainly not Thomas. Yet somehow she knew he meant every word. Ethan folded the paper and slipped it back into his pocket. "After reading that note, I wanted to know more about you." Emily looked surprised. Ethan smiled apologetically. "Nothing invasive. Just enough to understand why my father could not stop talking about a waitress from Harbor House Grill." A few people laughed softly. The tension eased. "What I discovered was someone working long hours while helping support her younger brother through college." Emily looked down immediately. She never liked discussing her sacrifices. Someone who consistently put other people first. Ethan continued. "Someone whose managers described her as dependable, honest, and kind." He glanced toward the owner. The man nodded immediately. "Every word is true." Ethan took a slow breath. "Then I learned about the restructuring plans affecting this restaurant." The room grew tense again. Employees exchanged worried looks. The layoffs. Everyone remembered. Ethan looked around carefully before speaking. "There is something all of you should know." Hope flickered across several faces. "This morning, Reed Properties finalized the acquisition of this building and the surrounding district operations." Shock rippled through the restaurant. The owner stared in disbelief. Several managers exchanged confused glances. Ethan smiled. "Which means the restructuring plan has been canceled." For a moment nobody reacted. Then the realization hit. Employees gasped. One server covered her mouth. Another began crying openly. The owner sat down heavily in the nearest chair. Ethan raised a hand gently. Nobody is losing their job. Applause erupted throughout the dining room. Relief spread like sunlight after a storm. Yet, even as people celebrated, Ethan's attention returned to Emily. The biggest surprise of all had not been revealed yet. And somewhere beyond the restaurant walls, Thomas Reed was already smiling, knowing that kindness had once again begun changing lives in ways money alone never could. The applause continued for several moments before finally fading. Employees looked relieved. Managers looked stunned. Customers smiled and whispered among themselves. Yet through all of it, Emily remained standing quietly near the center of the room, still trying to process everything that had happened. Just days earlier, she had been worried about paying bills and helping her brother stay in school. Now she found herself standing beside one of the most powerful business leaders in the country, while an entire restaurant celebrated around her. Life could change direction so quickly it almost felt unreal. Ethan waited for the room to settle before speaking again. There is one more thing. Instantly, the restaurant became quiet. Emily looked up. Ethan smiled. My father always taught me that gratitude should be expressed through action, not speeches. Several people nodded. That sounded exactly like the man they now knew as Thomas Reed. Ethan reached into his jacket and removed a folder. Emily, after learning about your situation, I spoke with my team, and with your permission we would like to offer you an opportunity. Emily blinked. An opportunity? Ethan nodded. A position within our community outreach division. Confusion crossed her face. Ethan continued. The role focuses on employee support programs, educational partnerships, and local scholarship initiatives. He smiled. The kind of work that requires understanding people. The room listened closely. The position includes full benefits, professional training, and a salary significantly higher than what you are currently earning. Emily stared at him. For a moment she could not find words. I do not know what to say. Ethan laughed softly. You can start by saying yes if you want the job. Laughter rippled through the room. Emily smiled despite herself. Yet before she could answer, Ethan raised a hand. There is something else. He looked directly at her. Your brother Mason has worked extremely hard to pursue his engineering degree. Emily's eyes widened. Ethan nodded. Reed Foundation will cover the remainder of his tuition through graduation. The restaurant erupted again. Several employees openly cheered. One server wiped tears from her face. The owner clapped so hard his hands turned red. Emily covered her mouth. This time she could not stop the tears forming in her eyes. Not because of the money. Not because of the job. Because for the first time in years, the weight she carried felt lighter. She thought of Mason studying late into the night. She thought of every extra shift she had worked. Every sacrifice. Every difficult decision. Suddenly the future looked different. Brighter. Possible. Ethan stepped closer and lowered his voice slightly. My father believes opportunities should go to people who understand the value of them. Emily shook her head. I only gave him a sandwich. Ethan smiled warmly. That is what you think. A familiar voice suddenly echoed from the back of the restaurant. And that is why she deserved all of this. Heads turned immediately. Standing near the entrance was Thomas Reed. He wore the same maintenance uniform, the same worn jacket, the same calm smile. Yet now everyone looked at him differently. Not because of who his son was, because of who he was. The room applauded as he slowly walked forward. Thomas stopped beside Emily and handed her a single white carnation. The same flower she had once watched him buy on a rainy afternoon. This was for my late wife, he said gently. She believed kindness was the greatest inheritance anyone could leave behind. Emily accepted the flower carefully. Thomas smiled. That night, you thought you were helping an old janitor. He paused. What you really did was remind an old man that the values he spent a lifetime teaching still exist. The restaurant fell silent once more. Thomas looked around the room. People spend too much time trying to impress those above them. His eyes softened. Character is revealed by how we treat those beneath our notice. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. The lesson was already written across every face present. Months later, the story would spread throughout the city. Employees would tell it. Customers would remember it. Executives would repeat it in meetings. Yet the most important part was never the job offer. Never the scholarship. Never the billionaire. The most important part happened on a cold Chicago night when a young waitress with almost nothing chose to share her last meal with someone she believed needed it more. Because the world saw a janitor. She saw a human being. And in the end, that made all the difference.